there, you awakened wonder. Thanks for joining me for a very special episode of Stay Free with Russell Brand. It's our conversation with Sam Harris, the intellectual neurologist, writer, and thinker, creator of the Waking Up with Sam Harris app. He gives away some fantastic free memberships to our community, so stay to the very end and become an awakened wonder by pressing the red button at the bottom of your screen right now to experience things like that. Now, of course, this conversation has already gone viral, particularly for those of you that watch it on Locals. You can watch these things first if you are an awakened wonder and a member of our Locals community. Now, if you're watching us on YouTube, the first 15 minutes will be here, but then I'm going to click over exclusively to the other place when we start talking about Trump, RFK, and the rise in populism. This has gone viral for a reason, because it was a great conversation. But if you stay all the way to the end, to the bit in Locals, you'll see that we meditate together. And even after quite a hot conversation, we find peace together. Also, there's a fantastic episode of Here's the News where we look at Biden's new drug negotiations and whether or not he really beat Big Pharma. You won't believe Kamala Harris's grandstanding speech and how it contrasts with the muted regulations and legislations that have been passed. Outrageous claims there. You're going to love all of it. But without further ado, let's move straight into our conversation with Sam Harris. Remember, if you're watching this on Rumble, give us a rumble, press the red button at the bottom of your screens right now and become an awakened wonder, like the people that are watching this live. That's how they do those screen grabs and let it go viral on Twitter or X. Are you calling it X yet? Let's welcome Sam Harris to the show. Thank you for joining us, Sam Harris, you beautiful man.
That's something I'm quite worried about. I'm not sure you and I would view the remedies in the same way.
How do we get beyond this cavalcade of my experts versus your experts, my flag versus your flag? By acknowledging that we are all an expression of one unitary force.
There's a methodology by which we would resolve those differences, and this shattering of our information space is making it very difficult to apply that methodology.
The thing that I intuit is we are on the precipice of new models. No one is conducting that research at Pfizer precisely because it isn't profitable. Have a little look around the Wuhan laboratory for infectious diseases and check out how it's funded and how it's regulated.
What I'm saying,
but Sam, more important than that, mate.
I'm saying these are domains of relative knowledge.
Do you agree we should start by addressing the most powerful interests in the world that seem to benefit more than ordinary people? Energy companies benefit when there's an energy crisis. The military-industrial complex benefits when there's a war. We have to address this.
We should let them get rich, right? And if you haven't...
No, this is wrong. I have to contest this, Sam. Thank you for joining us, Sam Harris, you beautiful man.
Happy to be here. It's great to see you, Russell.
When I met you, I remember in LA, you introduced me to Hiron Gracie, who became my BJJ teacher, along with my teacher, Chris Clear, over here in the UK. I'm now a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You still rolling?
Fantastic. No, I have not rolled since COVID, actually. Yeah, I was racking up a bunch of injuries, and at some point it seemed like a choice between aging somewhat gracefully and not. I just was getting neck injuries and hip injuries, and so it's through no fault of Hiron's, obviously. I mean, he's the perfect person to roll with. It's just it was just gravity at a certain point is not your friend.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. It's just one of the great losses of my life that I'm not currently rolling, and I keep fantasizing about going back, but it does worry me to go back. How have you been holding up? How's your body?
Pretty good. Right now, my knee hurts a little bit, my left knee, and my left shoulder hurts a little bit. What I try to do when rolling is very near the beginning of the session, establish a rapport with my opponent that I hope will translate into them on some level holding back slightly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, I was at some point I was only rolling with Hiron, right? So I mean, obviously he has nothing to prove. He can win at will. So I mean, he was the perfect teacher, and as you know, and grappling partner. But yeah, it's just bad luck. I ascribe it to bad luck and bad genes.
Mate, as this online space continues to evolve, the relationship that you have with Jordan Peterson, where two people with opposing views, with perfectly valid perspectives on both sides, has somehow been mapped onto the entire internet space, but perhaps without the congeniality and goodwill that I assume exists between you and Jordan. I wonder what your fears are as we increasingly find ourselves in some irresoluble cultural polemic that seems to be fueled by a will to impose, centralize, to accrue authority, to defeat without grace the opponent. How do you feel about this advancing space, and how can we engage in conversations with people we don't agree with in good faith? How can we take on board the views of those we disagree with and advance a mutual conversation? Or do we just accept now that centralized democracies such as America and the UK are finished and we have to start moving towards decentralized cultural and political models because there's just too much agitation elsewise?
Well, yeah, I share your concern about all this. This is something I'm quite worried about. I'm not sure you and I would view the remedies in the same way, but I can just kind of sketch out what I think the remedy is. I think we need to collectively develop the ability to worry about more than one thing at a time, right? So what I keep confronting are people who focus on one part of a troubling dichotomy. Take the tension between censorship, which I know you're worried about, and misinformation. Right now, I would acknowledge, that free speech is almost an intrinsic good. It's certainly the best error correcting mechanism we have, and that we should protect it at almost any cost, certainly politically. And yet there is this tension between misinformation and really becoming waking up in a society that's one day ungovernable on the basis of misinformation, where we just cannot converge on a fact-based discussion about anything because people are so siloed into their delusional echo chambers. And on the other side, our efforts to correct for misinformation, which increasingly look like censorship and increasingly are in tension with the almost intrinsic good of free speech, which we protect much better here in America than you do over there in the UK. So what I'm continually finding are people, we can talk about the left and right poles of the political spectrum as shorthand. It is not perfectly accurate now, but people on the left and the right can only focus on one of these bright, shiny objects at a time, right? They're only worried about misinformation, or they're only worried about censorship. They're only worried about wokeness, or they're only worried about Trumpism. They're only worried about, respect for tradition, or, innovating on everything, right? So there are all of these things that represent trade-offs where it's not a landscape of very clear distinctions between right and wrong and good and evil, but where we just have to figure out how to tune things, and or a trade-off between individualism and a commitment to the common good, right? I mean, like if you privilege individualism above everything else, you begin to lose your ability to create a society that any sane individual would want to live in, right? So if we respect your right to put smoke in the air above everything else, we have undermined my right to breathe clean air, right? There is a trade-off here. There's some amount of regulation I have to impose on you so that your enterprise doesn't f it up for everybody. And so there's a tension here. And what I continually find, I mean, it feels like 95% of people can focus on one problem and can't dignify any mention of the opposing trade-offs with even a single sane sentence, right? And our online space has devolved into a polarized conversation about this landscape of trade-offs.
I agree with you that these media silos are contributing to the inability to take on the perspective of the opposing side. And I think that no one's more guilty of creating these spaces than what are commonly, colloquially known as mainstream media spaces. Just today, we were looking at a broadcast on MSNBC where it was openly posited and quite enthusiastically so that were Trump to win the election in 2024, that he would immediately declare himself president for life, and therefore any opportunity to indict or indeed imprison Donald Trump will be lost forever. So nothing less than the future of democracy hung in the balance in the forthcoming 2024 election. Now, this was the claims that were being made in a specifically on MSNBC, and in particular it was Rachel Maddow. And I feel like it perhaps would be more beneficial if what you want to encourage is a rational discourse, to engage in to present rational arguments, and in particular to be candid, open and utterly transparent about the shortcomings of the side that you yourself advocate for. If freedom of speech means anything, it means the freedom of speech of your opponents. And I think we've seen over the last few years terms like misinformation, malinformation and disinformation enter the public discourse, not solely because there are now miracles around communication and technology that mean anyone with an idea and a rhetorical flourish can reach previously unprecedented audiences, but also because these new models precisely mean that centralizing and controlling any particular narrative is almost impossible, and the veracity of opposing information is indeed difficult to verify. I completely agree with you that we can't have single issue orators governing our space with sturm, drang and bombast. We do need to encourage I would say, inclusive discourses where people are, as I said in my initial question, are deliberately favoring the views of their opponent, willing to see where they can concede, willing to accept that my freedom may at some point impede on your freedom. What am I willing to sacrifice? Now, these ideas are precisely the kind of things that I turn to meditation for, Sam, and I know that you're here in part to talk in depth about your meditation app, which I admire and I love and I use. And I feel that precisely this kind of access to inner terrains that might provide us the ability to move beyond these spaces. One thing I'd also like to challenge, if I may, is that the distinction between left and right devolving into periphery versus center, to use Martin Gurry's terms there from his book, Revolt of the Public, is significant. That what we have now is anti-authoritarianism versus authoritarianism. And I feel that once that gets mapped into a meaningful political system, it's going to mean, to a degree, the devolution of power, further federalization, and an ability for communities to govern themselves. I said a lot there, Sam, but I know you can handle it. So please let me know what that provokes.
Yeah, no, I would take that reframing, certainly up to a point that, as I said, left and right don't really cover the landscape very well at this point. And so there is this anti-authoritarianism, I would say, and there's a contrarianism, there's an anti-establishment bias now, both on the right and the left. There's a distrust of power, there's a distrust of institutions, and it's understandable because our institutions have failed us in obvious ways. Certainly, they've proven themselves certainly at moments untrustworthy. So the loss of trust is understandable. But what I would say is that the corrective we need is not to tear everything down. We need institutions we can trust. We need to figure out how to reboot our institutions so that they are trustworthy, so that they're worthy of trust, and so that people actually trust them. And what I'm worried about now, given the online tools we have and the democratization of everything, and this almost apocalypse of contrarianism, is that even if we had trustworthy institutions across the board, we couldn't get a majority of people to trust them on any one point. Certainly not a point that is politically polarizing, right? So if we have a new pandemic, how do we get 90% of people to trust the mainstream medical message about what the facts on the ground really are, and how do we get people to trust government public health organizations as they give us up to the minute information insofar as they know it? and again, it's the basis for distrust is totally understandable because we witnessed one pratfall after another during COVID. But what I'm saying is that we need to get to, we absolutely need, and to speak locally in the US now, we need a CDC that we can trust. We need an FDA that we can trust. The fact that we feel that we can't trust these organizations is absolutely corrosive to the maintenance of a healthy society. And it certainly will put us in a position to fail once again to respond intelligently to the next pandemic. And what I worry about, again, what my concerns about COVID have, apart from the first few months when no one really knew what the hell was going on, my concerns about COVID have always been that it's a kind of dress rehearsal that we were obviously failing, right? And I worry that we're not learning the lessons of that failure, because I think it's just inevitable that we will one day have a pandemic that's quite a bit worse, and we will need to be able to respond with coherence and learn to cooperate at a global scale. And I'm not sure we're putting ourselves in a position to do that.
I do recall both in our nation and in yours, Sam, an incredible moment of goodwill at the commencement of the pandemic period, where people sort of intuitively understood that we were facing something unprecedented, and that indeed the principles of every measure, whether it's masking or lockdown or medications, is human life is, if not sacred, I'm aware of who I'm talking to, certainly valuable in a somewhat unique way, which, if not sacred,
I like sacred.
let's go with sacred
with me without apology.
Because if it isn't sacred, we're going to have to work out what the hell it is that makes human life so worthy of preservation. So we'll go with sacred for the purposes of this conversation. And any personal imposition is as nothing compared to our collective value and our joint duty to protect the vulnerable. But of course, what we saw, and these are just a few points I'm tracking, and I know that you're a busy man, but I'm sure you're broadly aware of the kind of media that I engage with and convey, is like the Albert Bourla, CEO of Pfizer, said it would be reprehensible if there were any profits made by Pfizer, and I think we all know that there were profits made by Pfizer, that their legal indemnity for any potential vaccine injury caused a lot of suspicion. The very fact that the FDA is significantly funded by the pharmaceutical industry causes a great many people concern, skepticism and cynicism. There are figures within the CDC, NIH, that have this is to one of our viewers here on the Locals platform, Primal Collins, says, that to get the kind of trust that we require, you would want no revolving door between corporations and, in this instance, Big Pharma. And if you are right, and it's sort of certainly across infinite time you are, that there will be another pandemic. I suppose personally what I would want is a real transparent, candid mea culpa about this is how we handled it, this is what we did wrong, this is what we'll never do again, this is what we exploited, this is how it was handled incorrectly, these were people that were shamed that shouldn't have been, that should never have been said, these companies should never have profited, Moderna should not have been invested in by a person who's now the Prime Minister in the UK. He set up a hedge fund that funded Moderna. None of those companies should have profited from a disaster of this nature. Certainly public politicians shouldn't have been partying during a time while the rest of us were locked down, and we must radically redress the ability that Big Pharma has to influence policy, because I recognise that no one's going to trust these government medical agencies until that's remedied. If that kind of conversation took place, I think that would go some way towards it. Do you think that's a possibility, and do you think that's a fair assessment?
I agree with the spirit of that. It would be hard to fashion a mea culpa so comprehensive that it satisfied everyone who was waiting for it, because I think we're going to, as a society, we're going to disagree about what the facts are still. So we're not in possession of the same set of facts. Like if I were to ask you or your listeners how many people they think died in America or the UK from COVID, right? I think we would see something like a bell curve distribution of assumptions, and we would find it very difficult to agree even just about that simple propositional claim. Just how many people died from COVID, right? We're suddenly going to have a conversation about the difference between dying from COVID and with COVID, and can we, and were people perversely incentivized to report deaths that were, one versus the other. But what you pointed to in your comments about pharma there are a set of perverse incentives that we have to worry about. I mean, so the profit motive in pharma is something that many of us, probably all of us, when we look at it, are uncomfortable with. But it's also not clear how to incentivize drug discovery in a way that works, that dissects out that perverse incentive, right? So yes, I was totally uncomfortable with the idea of a pharmaceutical company enjoying windfall profits during a pandemic and racing vaccines to market, knowing that billions of dollars were, waiting to hit the cash register. It's easy to see what could go wrong with that. And that, again, this is why we need an FDA and a CDC and other regulatory organizations we can trust. And your revolving door comment is totally valid, except the issue is there are only so many domain experts, right? So what sort of jobs do they get when they transition, right? And who do we want to be doing this research and to be deciding about regulation apart from people who know all of the details of this research? And you take a simple case, but let's take it off COVID for a second because that's so highly politicized. But take the fact that we as a society desperately need to create a new generation of antibiotics, right? For as long as you and I have been alive, we've lived in this bright, shiny moment where infectious disease has been radically curtailed by us having a very solid armamentarium of antibiotics that work, right? If the first antibiotic doesn't work, there's one behind that, and there's one behind that, and there's one behind that. But in the last, 25, 30 years or so, we have witnessed this growth of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and we know we don't have a good pipeline for developing new antibiotics. The reason why we don't have a good pipeline is because the drug companies can't be appropriately incentivized to do the work and to spend the money to develop these drugs, because this next antibiotic, the seventh antibiotic in line, when all the other ones fail, when you get some weird lung infection, right? And you've gone through 6 antibiotics and they haven't worked, and we got one left, right? That drug, whose name no one can pronounce, that is a drug that maybe you'll take once in your life for 10 days, right? It's not like Prozac, where you're going to take it for the rest of your life, or Viagra, where you're going to take it. It's something that most people are never going to take. And those of us who are unlucky enough to need it will take it once for 10 days, right? So there's not enough profit in this thing. And it takes $1 billion to discover this drug, right? And bring it to market. Yeah. So how do you get companies to do this? And if we were going to make governments do this, how badly would they handle that project, right? So this is a problem of incentives and trade-offs, and we have to figure out how to untangle all this in a way that preserves public trust in institutions. And it is a hard problem.
It's astonishing to me that it was once the role of the left to offer very aggressive critiques of those kind of models, and now they are entirely bereft of them, whether it's on the subject of war or the sort of immersive and disruptive power of Big Pharma. It no longer seems to be whilst earlier on I did offer a alternative to those labels, as we discussed, it seems to me that any attacks on the militarism, particularly with regard to Ukraine-Russia conflict, and the role of pharma and corporations more broadly, seems to be coming from the right. And that's sort of extraordinary for me with my own particular political and cultural heritage. And I also like to add, while I've got this opportunity, that I take neither Prozac nor Viagra on a daily basis. It's at most once every other day. A chance would be a fine thing. Yeah. We're going to leave YouTube now. So if you're watching us on YouTube, please click the link in the description to join us on Rumble, where I'll be asking Sam Harris about the popularity of figures like Donald Trump, about whom he has spoken extensively, and Robert F. Kennedy. Why are we seeing this rise in populism? If you want to see how Sam's going to respond to that question, click on the link. Also, Sam's going to be giving away access to his Waking Up with Sam Harris meditation app, which is fantastic. So join us over on Rumble.